Okay. Ooh.
Hello.
Hello. How's it going?
It is going well. Happy Thursday.
Happy Thursday. Shaking it up a little bit this week. We were meant to do it yesterday and then life
Yes,
happened.
we
And so
wanted to keep everyone on their toes.
exactly. Or specifically my mother. Anyway, my name is Danica Waddell. I am the president and founder of Xena Financial Planning, and I'm joined by
And I am Mariana Llamas, and I am the associate planner at TNFP. And today's topic, we are covering the different ways or the different methods to track your spending, so your budget, your cash flow, whatever you want to call it. But first, I guess we should do a little bit of intro of what Xena Financial Planning is.
Yeah, Xena Financial Planning. We are a very small, just two of us, financial planning firm. We are fully virtual and we mostly work with people in the tech industry. But for the sake of these YouTube lives, the topics will sometimes be very specific to people that work in tech and other times they'll be more general. And so today's topic is pretty general. We're going to be talking about spending. And I think the big question with all of this is, why? Why do I need to know how much I spend? Like, what's the point? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think when people hear the word budget, alarms go off because it is very terrifying to actually face how much you spend, right? But why is it important? I think for a variety of different reasons, but I think the most important reason why you should know your lifestyle cost is in order to be able to plan ahead, right?
Mhm.
So regardless of what your goals are, it's going to vary, but everyone kind of has certain goals that they want to achieve. And if you don't know how much your lifestyle costs are, how can you even plan ahead? And even plan ahead, like I'm not talking about like plan for retirement, like 30 years into the future. And yes, that is important, but also plan for, is there anything that you want to accomplish this year? Is there a trip that is coming up and that you actually want to join, but you don't know if you can afford it or not, right? If you know your budget, if you know your lifestyle costs, you can make those educated decisions when the occasion presents itself.
Yeah, exactly. That's perfect. I think that's a really good summary of, I mean, and that's just one of the reasons, honestly, but it is a huge reason of why we both think that, having a reasonable idea about how much you spend is really important. It's really hard to plan for the future, again, whether that's 3 months from now or 30 years from now, if you don't know where you are today and you kind of don't know what your lifestyle costs are, what are your needs financially? What does it take to kind of run your day-to-day life?
Right.
So I think within that, we could go a lot of different. We could certainly go into more detail onto why that's important. But I do think from like the work that we do, it's very foundational and it leads to a lot of other things. So once we know what your spending rate is, then we can sort of determine how much you need in an emergency reserve. So it really does touch so many different aspects of your financial life.
Yes. And I will say that I think we think of a budget for people that don't have, that you have a certain income, but it applies to everyone, right?
Mhm.
Whether you are making $400,000 a year or 60,000 or like any range, it is
Mhm.
still very crucial. And we see that kind with our clients and just like in our profession that whether we're whatever place that you are in that scale, it is still very important. And someone making a lot more can still be running into issues with their spending.
Yeah, it never ceases to amaze me that, sometimes we'll see people that struggle to live on $50,000 a month and other people are struggling to live on $50,000 a year. And it doesn't really matter what your income level is. It's really important regardless.
Yes. So we know budgeting is important, knowing your expenses. I kind of want to not say the word budget
Yeah.
because it has certain yeah. But where should someone begin, right? Because I
Mhm.
think you mentioned like someone commented on like, I don't want to know my expenses because I actually have to like go through my transactions and like what have I spent, and it's scary, right? So where would you advise someone to start?
Yeah, it's such a hard thing to do. So first off, just I think it's fair to acknowledge that this is challenging for every single person. I don't think there's anybody for whom this is just completely easy. It hardly takes any time. It's just, comes naturally. It can be a real challenge just to even understand what your spending is. I think there are a couple different things that I want to call out first before we start talking about specific approaches. One is just that it's important to look as much as you can over a range of time. So if you just look at 1 week, that's not going to really be very representative, right? You want to look over, a month, absolute minimum a month, but ideally 6 months or maybe even a year, because what happens is our spending is very inconsistent, right? So you might buy plane tickets, 1 month and you've got a big spike in your expenses, and then you don't buy plane tickets again for 6 months. So really looking at a wide range of time as much as you can is ideal. And then the second big thing is to find a system that works for you. And once you find that system, that is the best system for you. So there's no like one size fits all. You should absolutely track every single thing in a spreadsheet. You don't have to do that if it doesn't work for you.
Mhm.
And if you love tracking every single expense in a spreadsheet, by all means, but you should do whichever system is the most that you're going to stick with,
Yep.
basically.
Yep. And the key is to actually look back at historical spending
Right.
and not run into the assumption that this month or this year will be different, because we
Mhm.
tend to the what we think our budget is versus like the actual truth usually always tends to be very, very different.
It is very different. Absolutely. So, in my younger life, when I didn't have children and all that, I was definitely on the more detailed side. But I will share first my current method, which is very simple and very high level, and it's basically all that I have time for. So, my preferred method for tracking my own spending is once a year, one time, I take my credit card year-end statement. I also look at things like Venmo, anything that I write a check for, that sort of thing. And I just aggregate it, right? So I just say like, okay, I spent, X $1,000 on my credit card for the year. I spent, an additional however many thousands of dollars on Venmo and checks. And then I divide by 12. And that's it. Like that's my spending for the year or per month, I guess. What I do like particularly about the credit card year-end statement, depending on who you bank with, there's different formats and some people don't do it at all. But Chase gives you this really nice statement at the end of the year, and it's like, this is how much you spent on groceries, and this is how much you can spend on gas, and you can see, every single transaction. They're not going to be perfect, so sometimes something will end up in the wrong category. You're like, oh, that wasn't travel, that should have been, shopping or something like that. But it gives me a very good idea of certainly what the total is, and then I have some concept of what the different categories are, even if it's not totally perfect.
Mhm, mhm. And the key is to kind of get an overall view. And regardless if the categories are perfect or not, but if there is a category that you see there, it's like, oh my gosh, I actually spent that much on whatever that category is, you can dig in a little bit further.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, some years, if I have the time, I will kind of go in and like recategorize things just because it's helpful to see it a little bit more accurately. And then other years, I just don't have the time, and it's like, all right, well, I know that some of these categories aren't accurate, but I still know what the total is. The total isn't going to change.
So, with knowing the total, what do you do with that information moving forward?
That's a great question. I'm not super diligent about making any changes. The main thing that I do is I sit down with my husband and we review it together. And we just say, like, wow, did you realize that we spent that much on travel or that much on whatever the category is? And then we say, like, do we need to make any adjustments? Right? There might be a thing where we're like, oh my gosh, we're just totally throwing money away on this thing. And we just, don't enjoy it. It's just sort of mindless spending. So I'd say that's the biggest thing. It's just sort of a taking a step back and considering if we need to make any adjustments. And it's not so much about the number itself, it's more about the categories. Like, oh my gosh, we're really overspending on eating out. Like that's just gotten out of hand or something like that. There's not a lot we do with the actual number at this point. I think when we get closer to retirement, we'll definitely be monitoring that a little bit more closely in terms of like, okay, do we need to cut back $1,000 a month or something like that? But for the most part, it's a conversation for the two of us to have about our spending, and then sort of an evaluation of if that still lines up with where we want to spend our money, and do we need to make any shifts?
Yep. I love that. And that method sounds very less intimidating and scary and overwhelming, right? There's not a lot of work that needs to be done to get that number.
Yeah, it does not take a lot of work. I mean, like I said, it literally takes an hour, maybe. And that's all that I have time for. And that's good enough. So if that's all that you are capable of, that's better than nothing for sure.
Yeah. And some other methods that are a little bit more intensive. And this could work if you are like planning for a specific goal and you really need to narrow down your spending and increase your savings, or tackle some debt that you have. Or you might just really like to have an awareness of where your money is going, any of that. So you could, again, go the old-fashioned way of tracking it manually. So old-fashioned paper, on paper, or a spreadsheet, right? There are a bunch of spreadsheets out online that you can use that can help you categorize your spending. But again, you still will have to look at your credit card transactions, your bank account, your Venmo, all of that in order to get the actual information. It's not just a guessing game. And
that's using like Mint or something, or is that separate?
That's separate. I mean, I personally do it on a spreadsheet, but I know that's very intensive. But I think nowadays we do have budgeting tools, like budgeting apps like Mint, right? Where it is as easy as linking your bank account and they will just categorize your transactions for you. You just open up the app and can see, oh, I spent this amount on whatever for the month.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of those tools are great, and spreadsheet, if you have the time and the energy and you're interested, I don't see anything wrong with tracking at that level of detail, and it's really very good information. So if you do that level of detail, it's going to be much more accurate than just the credit card year-end statement. I would say that sometimes people find this part of the process just really overwhelming. Like that's going to take so much time. In particular, like if you use something like Mint, sure, it categorizes for you, but I mean, half the time it's wrong. So you kind of have to go in and train it, oh no, when I go to this place, that's actually gas. It's not groceries. I'm going to Safeway, but I'm actually getting gas. So there is a lot of extra work, I think, when you're using a system like that. And it can be really helpful to just do it for a short period of time. So I do think that sometimes people think oh my gosh, doing that year round sounds horrible, just I'm going to spend every weekend categorizing transactions. I think it can be really informative just to even do it for a month or two. So just because you're dipping a toe into one of these systems doesn't mean you have to do it forever.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll also throw out another app there that we've heard from clients that it's worked for them. You need a budget, which is kind of like that envelope system, but modernized. So it's better as opposed to Mint, where it looks at past transactions. This app actually helps you plan ahead your future expenses, given what money you have in the bank, which can be nice.
Yeah. You Need a Budget has a lot of fans, or YNAB as it's called affectionately. And I've actually never tried it, but it is more forward-looking and it does help you kind of categorize your expenses. The envelope method, just for people that don't know what that means, again, that was a much more manual, physical process, but this would be the type of thing where, say, you had a travel budget for the year, and every paycheck or every month or something, you would put $100 into that envelope. And then when you go to buy, your next plane ticket, or say you're doing Christmas shopping, like there's the cash in your envelope that's sort of saved. So the idea is you're putting money aside with every paycheck towards specific items.
Mhm.
And so that's really where the name, the envelope method, comes from. But that's effectively what YNAB does, is it sort of mimics that system.
Yep. But again, it's a manual process. You may
Right.
want to do it for a couple months once you get a handle of things and then move on. But I guess with all of these, the most important thing is to find a method that does work for you and stick to it,
Mhm.
right? Do it in a consistent basis, whether it is a year, whether it's monthly, whether it's weekly, whatever works for you. Kind of incorporate this into your daily life and don't make it
Mhm.
a miserable task, right? It doesn't
Mhm.
have to be, uh, I guess, miserable.
No, it doesn't have to be miserable. I mean, it's not super fun. I think you can make it a little bit fun, but I do think one of the other parts of this that's really important is if you are in a relationship and you have any kind of shared finances, I think it's really important to kind of check in with each other about your household spending at minimum once a year. But potentially, like if it's a real issue in your household, it might be more of a monthly or a quarterly thing. But minimum once a year, you should be kind of sitting down and reviewing your spending with your partner and just making sure you're on the same page, because this is how things can get really kind of out of alignment and off track, so to speak, is if you're not having those sort of regular-ish check-ins.
Yep, yep. We're big fans of money dates. And if you don't have a significant other, invite your friends, right? Like make it an event. I
Mhm,
don't know, order pizza, do something that you like, and everyone just
mhm.
looks at their budget, right? It can
Yep.
be it can be an activity.
Mhm. I can. So I think one other thing, I don't know that it's like an official method, but is definitely a bare minimum of all of the things that we've talked about thus far, is to make sure that you're saving enough. And then if you kind of spend the rest, it's like, all right, well, you're not really tracking, but at least your savings is on track. So, but it's hard to know how much you need to save if you don't really know what your spending level is. But still, I mean, if you're maxing out your 401k and your emergency reserve is funded and you're saving ideally 15 or more percent of your income. If you spend the rest, that's not the end of the world. That would be like the absolute bare minimum, though, of sort of having a system for tracking
Mhm.
your spending.
Yeah, and that brings up a good point of what do you do with these like one-time expenses that don't they're not necessarily on a monthly basis,
Mhm.
and it's aside from your emergency reserve. But as we all
Mhm.
know, life does tend to happen, and there will be unexpected expenses throughout the year.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
how can you factor that into your spending?
Mhm. I mean, I think having as realistic of a budget as you can for that accounts for things like that. So, say for example, we talked about travel. It could be, your pet has to go to the emergency vet for surgery or something, but building in some kind of cushion for, you know, unpredictable or larger expenses. So say, you're not going to buy a new couch every month, but you do buy a new piece of furniture maybe once every year or two. So just building those sorts of things into your budget. It can be a little tricky to do that because again, you don't know when you're going to need a new couch or when your dog's going to go to the vet or something like that. But just having a little bit of flex, I guess, in your budget. And certainly you can look back historically and say, like, oh, yeah, it seems like every year I have a major car repair. Every year I need to get my brakes done or I need to, get something. And
Mhm.
so I think that looking historically can help you build that into your budget by just getting at least a ballpark idea. And then you are going to have some unexpected things. And so again, that's where an emergency reserve can be helpful. It's like, all right, if there is something that's truly an emergency, a tree falls on your house or something like that, you weren't expecting that expense, but that is what an emergency reserve is for. And then, once you pay for it, you have to build your reserve back up.
Yeah, yeah. Awesome. Any last tips or things that you want to share around tracking your spending?
Um, I think one of the things we touched on before was just having this idea of like, can I afford something? And I think it comes up a lot when, you're kind of moving through the world and it's like, ooh, I'm on Instagram and like there's an ad for a cool
Mhm.
pair of something, cool pair of shoes. And it's like, ooh, can I afford that? And we hear that a lot from clients, like, can I afford to do a trip? Can I afford to get a house cleaner? And one of my favorite sayings, I don't even know who to attribute it to, but the saying is basically, you can afford anything, you just can't afford everything. And so, yes, you can afford the house cleaner, and yes, you can afford the pair of shoes, but you might need to cut something else back. And if you don't know what your spending is, it's really hard to make those calls. So it just, I think, can be such a useful thing, and it really brings such a different level of intentionality into your spending if you're really clear. It's like, yes, I have an extra $200 a month to spend on something fun or whatever, but I don't have an extra $500. So if something comes up that's above my $200 limit, then I can't afford that, right? So I think it's a matter of understanding some of the trade-offs and knowing that, yeah, sure, you can say yes, but that means something else is probably going to have to get cut. So, and you
Yes.
might not have a lot of extra in I mean, some people have a lot of flexibility with their budget and other people it's very tight. And so there's not a whole lot of wiggle room.
Yeah, and with that, like, don't compare your budget, your spending to someone else, because it's always gonna vary. So give
Mm.
yourself grace and also don't compare. So
That's a great point to end on. We should have said that at the beginning. Give yourself a lot of grace with all of this, like
yes.
tons and tons of grace. Cause I think one of the things that comes up so much for people is the guilt and the shame and, oh my gosh, I spent too
Mhm.
much. That's not what this exercise is about. It's not about making you feel bad or, whatever. Like there's no good or bad here. It's really just information and
Yep.
allowing you to be intentional going forward. But I think that's such a great point that, yeah,
Yeah.
you don't want to compare yourself too much and give yourself as much grace as you possibly can.
And you will make mistakes along the way, and that is okay as long as you learn from them. Mistakes are inevitable. It'll happen. But
Very forgiving.
with that, thank you all for joining or watching this. And we'll be back in 2 weeks. If you have any topics that you want us to cover, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be sure to cover the topic.
Yeah. We'll see you next time. Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you.